Theorists of social identity have come up with 5 different strategies that individuals might use to explain their membership in groups or to otherwise maintain their motivations to stay within those groups. The first they've noted is that individuals tend to join groups because it provides them some sense of status. Perhaps by joining a particular volunteer organization, it says something about yourself, or it says something about your capacity to make large donations to the community, which demonstrate your wealth and exclusivity from others in ways that might climb you up the social ladder or otherwise position you higher in the social hierarchy. In this sense, some group membership is affiliated with forms of status that individuals might receive for relating to that group. In the context of marketing, by associating with certain groups, you might increase your brand status or status associations. Secondly, social identity theorists have noticed that by joining some groups, you increase your sense of stability in the community. It tends to demonstrate a certain sense of permanence. You might think about the way that something like membership in a church typically indicates a long-term life commitment or values-based ideological commitment that surely exceeds something smaller, even as considerable as a political party. Surely choice of congregation, choice of spiritual affiliation resonates with a form of stability that says something about your choice to involve yourself in various different groups and for lengths of time or places of permanence. In other instances, groups are joined with less stability, with shorter duration, and with less emphasis on future contribution. The third thing that social identity theorists have noted is that some groups are joined to provide a sense of legitimacy. You might think about the way that joining a particular academic organization provides legitimacy to you as a student and scholar. If you're in the academic honors fraternity, well, that indicates a certain level of achievement that helps distinguish you from others and, of course, provides a reputability or a validity as you include that on things like resumes or applications. In this sense, your membership in that fraternity provides some legitimacy to the claims of your own intellectual capacity. Fourth, social identity theorists have noted that some groups are more permeable than others. When we talk about group permeability, we're talking about the capacity to be a member in one group and in other groups. So you might think classically about our two-party system in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats. It's difficult to think of group permeability between these. Very rarely do individuals switch from Republicans to Democratic sides, and when they do, they're at risk of being labeled something like a flip-flopper, and it tends not to be a virtue or value that's well respected or understood by our constituents. And so instead, when we think about permeability, we might think about the way that you can be a group of perhaps one fan of music and also still a fan of a television show. Those two fandoms, those two groups or associations related to those media events aren't impermeable. You can enjoy both and still be members of both groups simultaneously. Finally, social identity theorists have identified a number of reasons why individuals might maintain their motivations to be within a group or maintain group membership as it relates to their ability to come up with worldview differences. Finally, scholars of communication and social identity theorists have identified a number of reasons why individuals might maintain commitments to a group in the sense that it helps them create cognitive alternatives or otherwise restructure the way that they view the world so that they can engage with other individuals who view the world like them, perhaps giving them a sense of empowerment, a sense of community, and a sense of self-efficacy or the ability to create change and make meaningful differences with the communities you interact with. These 5 different strategies for understanding identity and belief play out in different ways, but theorists of social identity and communication have noted that by thinking through the way that individuals join groups and for what reasons, we might identify the fact that some groups enable a certain sense of social mobility or even allow us to make arguments for social change. You might think about the way that protest movements for social change often emerge out of group membership, group organization, and group advocacy. Additionally, group membership also enables some sense of social creativity. Recall back to your time in high school with the various different tables at the lunchroom and the way that those different groups enable different self-expressions in ways that young kids, whether skateboarders, goths, punks, band kids, whatever they might have been as you think about those stereotypical archetypes of the high school lunchroom, each enabled a certain sense of self, a certain sense of group membership, a certain sense of community, culture, and otherwise the needs we need as a young person to grow and find our sense of self and esteem. Finally, social identity research and communication theorists have identified the empowering effect that developing these cognitive alternatives can have in group settings, which lead to individual transformation and also collective social change. Scholars of communication and theorists of identity have also observed a dark side to these strategies for understanding identity and belief, in the sense that in some instances, these same strategies can be used to create us versus them comparisons and create an otherwise form of social competition that leads to an us versus them dichotomy, which is often disempowering, bigoted, intolerant, and leads to hateful messages. You might think about the way that various different hate groups in the United States collect together, otherwise sharing their bigoted narratives in ways that enable them to think through such otherwise vile thoughts of intolerance. And so, while these same strategies of status, stability, legitimacy, permeability, and cognitive alternatives might be used positively and productively, they can also be used in ways that are disempowering or deeply concerning. Scholars who are interested in social identity theory often wonder why some individuals might self-categorize as members or representatives of one group, but not members or representatives of another group. Those individuals who study this are interested in the phenomenon of self-categorization, or why do individuals identify certain attributes related to some groups as associating with themselves and their personal core of beliefs, and otherwise identifying other groups as peripheral from their core of beliefs, and creating distinctions that create differences between those individuals within the in-group and those individuals within the out-group. Those scholars studying self-categorization often identify what they call prototypes. When we talk about prototypes, we're talking about a set of behaviors or attributes and attitudes or values that are perceived as acceptable and representative of the group's similarity. In this sense, individuals within those groups should act like these prototypes in order to better distinguish themselves as members of that group and otherwise demonstrate that they are not members of an outgroup or broader community. In this sense, prototypes tend to accentuate differences and provide categorical descriptions for the way that we should behave and act. In this sense, prototypes and individuals who serve as prototypes of groups can guide the way that audiences think, feel, and behave. If this sounds familiar to you, it's likely because as we think about social media influencers and the role of a social media influencers, these are effectively described by social identity theorists and those who work on describing the role of prototypes. Our course reading material actually provides us a really interesting passage about the role of the influencer that's particularly relevant as we think about our contemporary social media society. The text notes that a marginal member who diverges from the group norm in a direction that leans away from the outgroup and accentuates the outgroup's distinctiveness is less threatening than an in-group member who leans towards the outgroup and actually blurs the intergroup boundaries. This would be called anti-norm deviance, and this invites a more negative reaction from audiences. Now this might sound highly technical, but I think we can put it in the context of hip-hop and perhaps make it more explainable. Think about something like the nerdcore hip-hop. It's acceptable to take something like the nerd identity and stretch it within the package of identities associated with hip-hop, which were previously not all that accepting of nerds. However, doing that just makes hip-hop a little bit more broad as a community and group. However, taking something like the values of don't snitch or the values of hip-hop challenging authority and perceived perceptions of individual status and culture, then that perhaps would not be as acceptable. And so perhaps it's more likely to see nerds rapping than it would be to see police officers rapping, because perhaps there's a perceived inherent contradiction in police officers rapping that violates some of the group boundaries in ways that adding to those group boundaries by including something like nerddom or nerd culture otherwise increases hip-hop's distinctiveness and actually strengthens it. And so in this sense, deviations from the norms, as we talked about in social norm campaigns, can be perceived as acceptable and positive in the context of pro-norm deviance, or perceived as negative and unacceptable in the context of anti-norm deviance. I think hip-hop provides us an interesting space to think about how the evolution of in-group and out-group dynamics can shift and change culture over time. Perhaps you're familiar that in the early 80s and 90s, hip-hop as an American art form was hardly as well respected and certainly not nearly as prized. Most Grammys and awards were going to things like American folk music, pop music, and other genres of music that were largely exclusive of hip-hop and certainly exclusive of Black Americans in the United States. However, most recently, Kendrick Lamar won a Pulitzer Prize in classical music, and so certainly the structures and standards for what are considered prized American music are changing in our culture and society. And so the in-group, out-group dynamics have shifted. One thing we might ask is, what are the values of those outgroup contributions? At one point, hip-hop was an outgroup. It wasn't perceived as the dominant or otherwise acceptable form of American art and musical tradition. Now I think we're challenging that in many important ways. However, when hip-hop was structured as an outgroup, we might ask, what functions does it have? I'll note that outgroups really have three important roles that they play to society in ways that lead to social change and collective empowerment, and otherwise the facilitation of equality and better ethical communication. The first is that outgroups can often serve as important critics for those individuals within in-groups. You might think about the way that various different hip-hop organizations, including NWA, were able to demonstrate the threat that police brutality and concerns that they had among their communities in regards to police patrolling and police profiling affected those communities. So in this sense, NWA helps demonstrate the reality and the ongoing struggle for many Black Americans living in those neighborhoods in ways that perhaps other voices and other channels would have been less effective to. And so, the outgroup of NWA and hip-hop helps to serve as an in-group critic in ways that creates transformative change. The second thing we might note about the importance of outgroup perspectives is that they challenge the accepted wisdom of the majority, and they ask individuals to think critically and reflectively about their own beliefs, behaviors, and ways that they might be complicit or otherwise contributing to these same problems that are identified by those critics of the in-group. The third thing we might note about outgroups is that oftentimes outgroups actually fragment and splinter in ways that they end up forming other subgroups, and those subgroups themselves lead to new forms of social change, the representation of new identities, and arguments for new forms of empowerment. In this sense, social identity theorists have been at the cutting edge of describing social movements and emphasizing and articulating the ways in which individuals organize together to make arguments for advocacies in their own beliefs for their community.